Hey there! It's time to sit back and enjoy a brand new story again. However, today's tragic story is one that sparks heavy emotions, even to this day. So if you are very sensitive and easily get upset by tragedy and grief, we would advise you skip this story and move on to one of our other more lighthearted stories on our channel. If not, brace yourself for a roller coaster of emotions that will in all probability fill your soul again. Eddie grew up in Lancaster, Texas, a quiet town where he was known as a gentle soul. The decision to join the Marine Corps in 2006 was driven by a sense of duty, a desire to serve his country. Eddie was just 18 when he left home, his mother's voice echoing in his mind, telling him how proud she was. The young man who boarded the bus to boot camp was full of hope, believing he would return stronger, perhaps even a hero, but the Marines would change him in ways he never anticipated. His first deployment was to Iraq, where he served at a forward operating base. Although his job as a weapons repairman kept him somewhat away from the front line, the horrors of war were never far. The prison duty was the worst, guarding detainees, some of whom were just boys, their eyes hollow with fear. Eddie began to feel the weight of their pain, the agony of a country torn apart by violence. It seeped into his soul, and the Eddie who came back from Iraq wasn't the same young man who had left. After Iraq, Eddie's next mission took him to Haiti in 2010, where a devastating earthquake had reduced much of the country to rubble. The destruction was overwhelming. Bodies lined the streets, the stench of death lingering in the air. Eddie saw things no human should ever see. He would later speak of clearing bodies, including those of babies, though the exact details were unclear. Whether these memories were real or distorted by his deteriorating mind, they haunted him just the same. Returning to civilian life was far more challenging than Eddie had ever imagined. He tried to fit back into the rhythm of daily life, but everything felt off. The familiar places and faces no longer offered comfort. Instead, they only served as reminders of how much he had changed. Eddie's family noticed the difference immediately. His once easygoing demeanor was replaced by a sense of restlessness, a constant state of unease that he could never shake. His mother, Jody, watched helplessly as her son became a shadow of the young man she had raised. She saw how his hands would tremble when he thought no one was watching, how his eyes darted around a room as if searching for threats that weren't there. Jody did everything she could to help Eddie. She encouraged him to seek therapy, to talk about what he was feeling, but Eddie resisted. Talking about his experiences felt like reliving them, and the last thing he wanted was to confront the nightmares that plagued his sleep. The VA offered him medication, but it was never enough to quiet the noise in his head. The pills made him feel disconnected, even from himself, as if he was watching his life through a distorted lens. As the months wore on, Eddie's condition worsened. The paranoia that had been a quiet whisper in the back of his mind began to grow louder, more insistent. He became convinced that people were watching him, that the government was spying on his every move. He would spend hours online reading about conspiracy theories, each one feeding into his delusions. Eddie's relationship with his girlfriend, Jennifer, also began to unravel. She tried to be supportive, but she was young and overwhelmed by the weight of Eddie's mental health struggles. She didn't know how to help him, and Eddie's erratic behavior only pushed her further away. He would accuse her of things that made no sense, convinced that she was in on the supposed plots against him. One night, the paranoia reached a fever pitch. Eddie was at Jennifer's apartment, his thoughts racing, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. He looked at Jennifer and her roommate, convinced that they were hiding something from him. His mind twisted their every word and action into evidence of a conspiracy. In a panic, Eddie grabbed a knife from the kitchen and barricaded the door. He refused to let Jennifer or her roommate leave, certain that if they did, something catastrophic would happen. Jennifer pleaded with him to put the knife down, to let them go, but Eddie was beyond reason. He was trapped in his own mind, a prisoner of his delusions. The police were called, and Eddie was taken to a hospital, where he was placed on a psychiatric hold, but once again the system failed him. Despite his increasingly erratic behavior, the VA discharged him after a few days, deciding that his paranoia had subsided enough for him to be released. Eddie returned home, but the darkness that had taken hold of his mind remained. Jody was at her wit's end. She had watched her son deteriorate before her eyes, and she felt powerless to stop it. Every time she saw Eddie, it was as if a little more of him had disappeared, swallowed up by the invisible demons that haunted him. She feared for his safety, but even more, she feared what he might do in one of his psychotic episodes. It was in this state of desperation that Jody reached out to Chris Kyle. Chris had become something of a legend, not just for his exploits as a Navy SEAL, but for his dedication to helping veterans like Eddie. Jody had heard about how Chris had worked with others struggling with PTSD, and she hoped that maybe, just maybe, he could help her son. Chris was known for his no-nonsense approach, but he also had a deep compassion for his fellow servicemen and women. When Jody contacted him, Chris listened to her concerns and agreed to meet Eddie. He didn't promise miracles. He knew better than anyone that there were no easy fixes when it came to the scars of war, but he was willing to try. The plan was simple. Chris would take Eddie to a shooting range, a place where they could talk, where Eddie might feel comfortable opening up. Shooting had always been therapeutic for Chris. It was a way to clear his mind, to focus on something tangible. He hoped it might do the same for Eddie. February the 2nd, 2013, dawned like any other day in Texas. The sky was clear, the air crisp with the promise of a new beginning. Eddie, however, woke up with a sense of foreboding. The paranoia that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long now threatened to consume him completely. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that danger was lurking just out of sight. Chris and Chad Littlefield arrived to pick Eddie up that morning. Chad Littlefield was a close friend of Chris Kyle. The two men shared a deep bond rooted in their mutual respect for each other's character and commitment to helping fellow veterans. Chad was not a military veteran himself, but he was deeply involved in supporting Chris's mission to assist those struggling with the transition back to civilian life, particularly veterans dealing with PTSD. Chris, ever the optimist, believed that today might be a turning point for Eddie. He greeted Eddie with a firm handshake, his calm demeanor in complete contrast to the storm raging inside Eddie's mind. The drive to the shooting range was tense. Eddie sat in the back seat silent, his thoughts spiraling. He was certain that Chris and Chad were talking about him, plotting something. Every glance they exchanged, every word they spoke, fed into his growing paranoia. By the time they arrived at the range, Eddie was on edge, his mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. As they prepared to start shooting, Eddie's thoughts became more disjointed. He couldn't focus on what Chris was saying. The words seemed to float in and out of his consciousness. All he could think about was the gun in his hand and the nagging suspicion that Chris and Chad were planning to kill him. The rational part of his mind was overwhelmed by the delusions, and he felt trapped, like a cornered animal. Chris, sensing Eddie's discomfort, tried to reassure him, but his words only heightened Eddie's anxiety. The more Chris talked, the more Eddie became convinced that he was in danger. The gun felt heavy in his hand, a symbol of both protection and threat. The line between reality and delusion blurred, and in that moment of panic, Eddie made a decision that would change his life, along with thousands of other lives forever. Without warning, Eddie turned the gun on Chris and Chad, his movements quick and decisive. The gunshots echoed across the range, a brutal punctuation to the silence that followed. Chris and Chad fell to the ground, their lives extinguished in an instant. Eddie stood there, the gun still in his hand, his mind struggling to comprehend what he had just done. The paranoia that had driven him to pull the trigger began to recede, leaving behind a horrifying clarity. He looked down at the bodies of the two men who had tried to help him and felt an overwhelming wave of regret and confusion. The news of Chris Kyle's murder sent shockwaves across the nation. Chris was not just any veteran, he was a legend, a symbol of American heroism. His book, American Sniper, had become a bestseller, and his story was one of resilience and patriotism. The idea that a fellow veteran had killed him was almost too much to comprehend. As details emerged, the public's initial reaction was one of disbelief. How could a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country and to helping other veterans be gunned down by someone he was trying to help? The tragedy struck a deep nerve, especially among the veteran community who viewed Chris as one of their own. The sense of loss was profound, and the anger and outrage that followed almost unmatched. News outlets were flooded with stories about Chris's life and legacy. Tributes poured in from across the country, with people praising his courage and his commitment to helping others. But alongside the grief, there was a growing conversation about the state of mental health care for veterans. Eddie Ray Routh became a symbol of the system's failures, a veteran who had been chewed up and spat out by the very institutions that were supposed to care for him. Social media was ablaze with reactions. Some people expressed sympathy for Eddie, arguing that he was a victim of a broken system, while others were furious, demanding justice for Chris and Chad. The debate over Eddie's mental state at the time of the murders became a focal point, with many questioning how someone so clearly unwell could have been allowed to spiral so far out of control. Eddie Ray Routh's trial began in early 2015, and it quickly became a media spectacle. The courtroom was packed with journalists, veterans, and members of the public eager to see how the case would unfold. True to form, the legal teams proceeded to attempt to portray Eddie in grossly skewed views on either side of the spectrum. The prosecution painted a picture of a cold-blooded killer, a man who had taken the lives of two good men without remorse. They argued that despite his mental illness, Eddie knew what he was doing when he pulled the trigger. The defense, on the other hand, argued that Eddie was not in control of his actions. They presented evidence of his severe PTSD, his psychotic episodes, and the repeated failures of the VA to provide adequate care. They claimed that Eddie believed his life was in danger when he shot Chris and Chad, that his delusions had convinced him they were out to kill him. Throughout the trial, the jury was presented with harrowing testimony from mental health experts, family members, and those who had interacted with Eddie in the months leading up to the murders. The prosecution's cross-examinations were brutal, as they attempted to dismantle the defense's argument piece by piece. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, with every detail of Eddie's life laid bare for the world to see. In the end, the jury found Eddie Ray Routh guilty of capital murder. The verdict was met with a mixture of relief and sorrow. For many, it was the justice they had been waiting for. For others, it was a stark reminder of the complexities of mental illness and the tragic consequences of a system that had failed one of its own. Eddie was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For him, prison became another kind of battlefield, one where he was left alone with his thoughts and the memories of what he had done. The man who had once served his country with honor was now imprisoned by the very demons he had sought to escape. In prison, Eddie's mental state continued to deteriorate. He was placed in solitary confinement for his own safety, where the isolation only exacerbated his already fragile mental health. The walls of his cell became both a refuge and a prison, keeping him physically safe, but mentally trapped in the endless loop of his thoughts. He received some mental health treatment while incarcerated, but it was too little, too late. The structure and routine of prison life provided some semblance of stability, but it did nothing to address the deep-seated issues that had driven him to commit such a heinous act. Eddie's interactions with other inmates were minimal, and he became increasingly withdrawn, retreating further into his own mind. The years passed slowly for Eddie, each day blending into the next. The media attention that had surrounded his trial eventually faded, and he became just another inmate, his story a cautionary tale about the consequences of untreated mental illness. For the public, Eddie Ray Routh was a man to be forgotten, but for those who knew him, his life was a tragic reminder of the human cost of war. And that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you again for joining us, and remember to let us know in the comments what your stance on this tragedy is. Do you think Eddie is a victim of the system, or do you think he is a monster? Also, a friendly reminder to please support our efforts in helping all the innocent pups by subscribing. You backing this effort is priceless. Much love and see you soon.